What is up, guys? It's your boy SteadyChaos coming to you with a new video for the LG C10 and The Last of Us Part 2. Now, no matter what you think about The Last of Us Part 2 story-wise, I know the game is divisive. I'm not going to touch on that. All I want to talk about is, technically speaking, how this game is such a damn masterpiece. It is beautiful looking. It really looks like a next-gen game, and it's gonna honestly probably be released on the PlayStation 5, or at least be patched for the PlayStation 5, most likely in 4K 60 frames per second. It's gonna look absolutely amazing, because as it stands now, running on the PS4 Pro natively at 1440p in high dynamic range, upscaled to 4K, it looks absolutely breathtaking. Let me just quickly jog you guys through this forest with Ellie and Dina. And I'm recording this in native 4K on my GoPro Hero 8, and I've set up the camera in such a way that I'm trying to capture this footage in a way that best sort of captures what the TV and the game look like if you were sitting right in front of it. Obviously, it's not going to look quite as good coming through this camera and then being compressed by YouTube, but suffice to say, if you are sitting here in front of this 55-inch C10 and you are playing The Last of Us Part 2 in HDR10, oh man, upscaled to 4K, it's just out of this world. I mean, look at how lush this forest looks. Look at how just green and saturated the plants are, and the vegetation, and the lights streaming through the forest canopy. It's just, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you have already played The Last of Us Part 2. At this point, it's been out for a solid week now, so you guys are well aware of the graphical fidelity of this game. I mean, it goes without saying. Everybody knows how gorgeous it looks, but I just can't get over how good it looks on a 55-inch screen, you know, sitting about 5 or 6 feet back, running HDR10. The image not only pops, but the HDR and the color saturation, they just give it this lifelike quality. And you know, you combine that with just the absolutely breathtaking environmental detail and scenery and the character models. I mean, I don't even want to imagine how many polygons these character models are made up of. It's just millions upon millions, if not freaking billions. But look at this scenery as you come out. You look at the sun-soaked vegetation. The landscape expands. You see all these stranded cars being overgrown. I mean, something about HDR, it just, especially in this game, and I have the game, I'm going to go over my picture settings real quick for you guys. And again, I always kind of preface picture setting videos with this following disclaimer that, you know, it's your TV, you've paid the money for it, you're the one that sits in front of it, so there's no right or wrong way to really set up your television. You set up your television the way you see fit. I merely offer my picture settings as a suggestion and a guide. If you want to use them, by all means use them, and let me know how they look for you in the comment section down below. But by no means am I telling you that these are the right picture settings. So to jump in real quick, go to all settings. Now, go down to additional settings really quick. Make sure HDMI deep color is on. If for your source, if you're playing HDR10 like this game, you want to make sure that's on, otherwise you won't get true 10-bit color. Make sure instant game response is on so that you're getting the lowest input lag. And then you go up to picture mode settings. Obviously you use game. Now this is running in HDR10, as I've said now multiple times. Anytime you're running an HDR source, ideally, and I'm not saying you have to, but ideally you want to run OLED light and contrast both at 100, okay? The reason you do that is because you want to maximize your dynamic range, so you want the greatest depth and contrast between your inky darks and your brightest specular highlights. Now if you start reducing OLED light and contrast to say 75, 70, 65, 60, you're just compressing and mitigating your TV's performance when it comes to high dynamic range. You're shrinking that range between darkness and brightness, and if you're going to be doing that, you might as well just play in SDR. So that is why most people will say, including professional calibrators and myself, although I will admit I am by no means any sort of professional calibrator. But when you're running HDR content, you want to keep these both at 100. There's a reason why when you automatically put your, or I shouldn't say automatically, but whenever you run an HDR source and your TV automatically detects it, there's a reason why it puts the contrast in the OLED light or the backlight if you're using an LED at both at 100. The TV does this automatically upon detecting an HDR source, and it's doing that because it's high dynamic range. It's trying to make sure that you're getting those vivid highlights, that the colors pop, and that specular highlights are just that, they're highlights. Brightness I have to 50, that's the default value, I would not change that. Sharpness, again, very subjective. You want to set this to, 25, 30, 35, 40, go for it. The one thing I've noticed about this game, though, is that the developers installed or implemented a bit of a filmic grain look to it. So anytime you turn, or at least in my experience, anytime I turn the sharpness up to what I would normally use, say 15 or even 20, it makes that grain all the more pronounced. And in my opinion, it's a little bit distracting. And so I usually, for this game, just for this game, I usually set the sharpness somewhere between 0 and 5 for this game. It tends to kind of mitigate or clean up some of that grain so it's not quite so pronounced. Color, this is a little bit of a departure from other games, say like Death Stranding or Days Gone, where I tend to pump up the color a little bit more in HDR, usually between 55 and 60. However, for this game, I find that it's more often than not, the game is kind of drab looking. That's the atmosphere, that's the environment that the developers are going for. It's a post-apocalyptic setting. There are no street lights, there are no neon building lights, anything like that. Everything is naturally illuminated from the sun or from the moon, or oftentimes there's an overcast setting and you're getting these subtle lighting conditions. But the general look of this game is depressive, it's dark, it's dreary, and I find that if I pump the color up to 60, it tends to make things a little bit too vibrant and fruity for a game that's looking for sort of a drab and dark kind of tone. I intentionally set it down towards 50. And I feel like that's plenty enough color to still give me enough pop where I need it, but also it keeps the game looking as it should, sort of drab, dreary, hopeless, depressive, dark, because that's what this game really is. And then tint, I don't touch that, I never really touch that. You go into advanced controls, dynamic contrast off. You really don't need any artificial dynamic contrast from your television when you're already running high dynamic range. Now, dynamic tone mapping is a big one. I set this to on. I know a lot of people in the gaming community or in the YouTube community, especially with the LG C10, they think that off is a better setting, and off probably is a more accurate setting. I am sure that off would follow the EOTF curve more accurately with sort of a gentle roll off at this TV's highest peak setting, or highest peak nits, which is around 750 to 800 nits. But I find that the screen is a little bit too dim for my liking, even though it does look nice and accurate. You can try HGig if you want, but in my opinion, there's just really no difference between HGig and off. HGig is sort of a new HDR format that is specifically designed by various companies to take advantage of high dynamic range in video games. But it's such a new format that not many games, like I said, have taken advantage of it, except for Call of Duty Modern Warfare. So that is why a game like The Last of Us Part 2, which has not been programmed with HGig in mind, it looks no different between HGig and off. Some of your brightest highlights, like if you look up towards the sun maybe, let me see if I can do that here. There might be a slight difference between HGig and off. Let's take a look. Yeah, so you see that you get some slightly brighter highlights from the sun here. Off, it just looks kind of dull. HGig gives it the clouds a little bit more definition around the edges, a little bit brighter, and the sun's rays look a little bit more pronounced, which is a nice effect. But you go to on, and bam, you really add some nice brightness. And some may argue that it's so bright. Basically what dynamic tone mapping on means is the TV is dynamically mapping out the high dynamic range on a scene by scene basis. And it's probably not quite as accurate as the offsetting is, but it is far more visually pleasing. And in my experience, I have not really seen any clipping per se, or at least no clipping to the point where I say to myself, okay, I'm losing way too much detail in my bright highlights. I need to turn dynamic tone mapping off. Because in my opinion, it's so much more colorful and bright and aesthetically pleasing on dynamic tone mapping on, that I'm willing to sacrifice the slightest bit of clipping, should it even exist. And like I said, I don't even notice any really. I mean, look it off again. Really dim. I mean, in my TV, as you saw, this TV, the C10, is set at 100 OLED light and 100 contrast, and it's this dim with dynamic tone mapping off. And then on HGig, you're really gaining nothing in the sort of lower and moderate specular highlight details, like on the leaves here and on the ground and reflections. You're really not gaining much from HGig at all. You are gaining a little bit in the brightest of highlights here, as you can see. But otherwise, you're not gaining much. And look at on. Bam. Oh, it looks so much better in my opinion. And like I said, minimal clipping, if at all, and you've got a far brighter, far more saturated picture that is far more pleasing to the eye. And in my opinion, looks more realistic. Look at the detail on the ground and the pavement right here. You can see the textures. It just looks really, really nice. You set it to off, it still looks nice. It just looks muted. It looks too dim. And HGig, honestly, it looks like HGig has almost clips a little bit in and of itself. Look at off, okay? You have this reflection of the sun right here. It's nice and smooth. It's really, really bright and white at the center of the circle, but as it moves out, you have shades that become less bright, and it's a nice, smooth transition. When you go to HGig, look at it, it becomes one giant blob of a circle, and it clips. And I wouldn't have expected that because HGig is so dim, but when it comes to specular highlights, it looks like it might even be clipping a little bit. Although it doesn't look too bad in the sun there. It just doesn't look, the reflection does not look right there with HGig on. And again, keep in mind, like I said, this game has not been developed for HGig in mind. Basically what HGig means is that the system, the PlayStation, is doing the tone mapping, not the TV. If you go to dynamic tone mapping on, let's see what happens to this reflection of the sun here. So it too, like HGig, turns into a bit of a blob, but not quite as bad as HGig. Look at HGig, solid circle, no color differentiation whatsoever in here. None. It's, oops, sorry about that. It's just one giant circle that is bright white. You go to dynamic tone mapping on, and it's a little bit less blown out. There's a little bit more detail. You can see that the inner ring of the circle is pretty bright, but then there's a little bit of an outer ring that is a shade darker. And then yet one more ring out here that's a shade even darker than that. So I feel like there's even less clipping with dynamic tone mapping on, even though it's strange because with dynamic tone mapping on, you know, your less bright highlights like the grass, the leaves, areas where you have some highlights, but they're not nowhere near as bright as, say, a sun or a streetlight or anything. Those highlights with dynamic tone mapping on, they really pop. You know, these areas up here, the grass down here, it really pops. It really looks nice. But then when it comes to the brightest highlights, like these reflections, they don't clip quite as much as, say, HGig. But at the same time, HGig is a dimmer overall picture. It's really kind of confusing. That is why I say at this point, it's just a matter of preference. You set it how you see fit and what looks most pleasing to you. If you are noticing that you have extreme levels of clipping throughout a scene and you just don't like it, then turn HGig off. But if you feel like you're getting a more realistic picture and you feel like you like how the highlights look, you like how the sun looks, you like how headlights on a car look, then by all means go for it. You're not wrong either way, really. And moving on to super resolution, just you turn that off. You don't need that. I mean, especially if you were to turn it to high, you're not deriving much benefit, and you're probably also exaggerating some of that noise or static or grain, if you will, that the developers have implemented on The Last of Us Part 2. And I just, in my opinion, the grain is a little bit too high to begin with, so I wouldn't want to exacerbate that by putting super resolution on high. So I just turned it off. Color gamut auto. The TV will automatically select the correct color gamut for you. You could put it on wide, which is for HDR10 sources, but I've seen conflicting reports online. Some people say you should leave it on auto. That is technically the correct setting. What wide does, it takes the source and expands the color to the TV's native potential. And if the TV's native potential is 98 or 99% DCI-P3, and you're running a game in HDR10 that uses the DCI-P3 color space, I don't see why you couldn't use wide if you were so inclined. But if you're switching between HDR and SDR content regularly, there's no reason not to just leave it on auto. That is what I do, and I believe that is the correct setting. But why don't you, feel free to experiment with it and let me know what you think in the comments below. White balance, I go with warm 2. I used to go with warm 1, but I feel like the more I use this OLED, and OLEDs in general, they really do have a bluish tint to them. So I try to combat that by going warm 1 or warm 2. Warm 3 is just a little bit too much in my opinion, so I keep it at warm 2, and then I go down here under the method 2 point and I turn blue down to -6. I used to do warm 1, blue -12, but since I've been doing warm 2, at least for this game, I do blue -6 now. That looks best to me. Again, totally subjective, you do what you gotta do. Color management, I don't touch it. Peak brightness is automatically set to high when in HDR mode. And then picture options, noise reduction off, MPEG noise reduction off, smooth gradation all off. You really don't want additional picture processing from these settings because then you could be introducing more input lag. So just leave that off. Black level, I have it set to low. You can also do auto, but with high dynamic range, typically I set it to low. High just washes out the picture. You want to set it to low so you get that nice punchy contrasted image, or auto. Motion eye care off, true motion off. I do not use BFI in any of my games. I really don't think black frame insertion does anything. I just don't think it helps at all. First of all, on high, you're getting perceptible flicker. I mean, you really are. It gets to the point where if I were to use this high setting for any more than 15 or 20 minutes, I would go crazy. I can see the flicker, especially in bright areas like the sky, and it really, really, really dims the picture. In dark rooms in The Last of Us, there are a lot of dark rooms. With BFI set to high, you're crushing your black shadow detail. You're having a hard time seeing. It's not worth it. It really isn't. And with the added lag, I mean, yes, you might be improving motion resolution to 1080p, but honestly, I just don't think it's enough of a benefit to outweigh the downfalls of a really dim picture, flicker, and crushed shadow detail. You can go medium and low, which there's less shadow detail crushing and the screen isn't quite as dim, but at the same time, there's not as much motion improvement with low and medium settings. So the only way you're going to get really good motion clarity and improvement is on high, but I just told you that using high, the flicker is so bad and it's so dim, it's just not worth it. This LG C10 has such good motion handling and motion processing. There's really no need for BFI, especially when using high dynamic range content. It really dims your image, and it really kills HDR, and it really kills specular highlights. I mean, look at that. It's just far too dim. So now, if you want to take a look at my SDR settings real quick, we can jump to those. Just go into the, one more thing quickly that I do, maybe it's something you guys would be interested in seeing. If you go down to options, accessibility, motion sickness, I turn my field of view up to 5. It gives you a wider field of view when you're in combat, and you can see kind of your peripheral a little bit better. So if you have clickers or runners coming up on you, it gives you better situational awareness. But also I feel like it makes the game look better because the environments are so beautiful, and by setting the field of view from its standard 0 setting all the way up to 5, what you're doing is you're pulling that camera back and you're getting a greater view of the environment around you, and you're just really taking in those details and the graphics, and it's beautiful in my opinion. You know, if you were to go the opposite direction, set it to -5, you're really going to draw that camera in tight. Let's take a look. See how it draws that camera in really tight on the characters? Now, I mean, it's not dramatic, but it's noticeable. Let's go back to what I had it set at. It pulls that camera out nicely, and you just get a better view of your surroundings. But, you know, it's totally up to you. It's completely subjective. But that's what I do. So let's go to display, brightness, HDR off. So really quickly look at my settings for this. You see it's still a nice image. It looks good. It just doesn't have that highlight detail that it had in HDR. The screen overall is dimmer. You know, you're probably operating with 250 to 300 nits of brightness right here in SDR mode. And in HDR mode, like I said, you're operating at 750 to 800 nits of brightness. So it's a big difference. And you can see the colors look a little bit more muted. You look up at the sun. The sun just, it kind of looks clipped a little bit, and there's really no detail. You can barely see the sun rays. You look at the down here at the reflection. It looks pretty smooth. It's not blown out like it was in HGig, but it's just not, it doesn't have that bright impact, that effect, that wow effect that HDR has. So let's jump really quickly though into my settings for you guys. All settings, again, the same. Energy saving off, game mode. I have OLED light at 65. Contrast 90, brightness 50, sharpness again 0 because of the noise or film grain that the developers have implemented. I pump up the color to between 55 and 60 on SDR mode because you're not dealing with that Rec 2020 color space anymore in SDR. You're dealing with Rec 709 and slightly more muted colors. So to combat that a little bit, I usually pump the color up to 55 or 60. I have it 58 here. Tint 0, advanced controls, I don't touch any of these. Again, off, off. Color gamut auto, per usual. Gamma 2.2. 2.4 is a little bit too dark, although it is a slightly more contrasted image. But 2.2 gives you nice shadow detail and allows you to easily navigate dark rooms in The Last of Us Part 2. White balance the same, warm 2, blue -6. Peak brightness is automatically off in SDR. Picture options, all these things off. Black level auto. Look, low is just, it's nice and contrasted, but it's you're crushing your detail a little bit in low. So I would keep it at auto, which is basically high. Motion eye care off, and true motion again off. So that's about it, guys. Those are my picture settings specifically for The Last of Us Part 2 on the LG C10 in both HDR10 and SDR mode. One more time, let's take a look at that. HDR, we'll turn it on. The TV detects it, and down here it's a nice little touch that Naughty Dog has implemented. You can also adjust the contrast and brightness within the game itself, therefore manipulating your shadows, your midtones, and your brights. I don't really mess with these. A few times I've pumped the contrast up. Let's try pumping it all the way up and see what it looks like. It crushes your shadow detail a little bit. It does provide a very nice contrasted image with some solid pop, but this setting would be too difficult to see in if you were in a very dark room or you were in a very dark, dimly lit setting. It just would not provide you enough shadow detail, and it would be a struggle. So I usually set it at 0 or maybe like 1 or 2 to give myself just a little bit extra pop. Yeah, right there. It looks pretty nice. It is, I mean, this game is insane. It's beautiful. So yeah, guys, that's about it. That's gonna do it for me. Let me know what you guys think of this game. If you have it and you've played it, let me know. Not talking about story, I know that's divisive. I'm just talking about technically speaking. What do you guys think of the graphics? How does the game look on your monitor or TV? If you have the LG C10, what are your settings? If you liked this video or found it helpful, then certainly by all means leave a like. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel, guys. And until next time, we will see you later. Peace.